There are certain moments in life where you realize you've been pushed just a little too far, and instead of backing down, something shifts inside you and you decide to push back. Hard. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday morning in February, standing in my driveway in 14-degree weather, holding a bright yellow envelope that had just been stuffed into my mailbox, containing a fine for a snow pile. Not a dangerous snow pile. Not a pile blocking a road or a sidewalk or anyone's line of sight. Just a pile. A pile of snow that I had shoveled off my own driveway and stacked neatly against my own fence, like any reasonable person would do after 16 inches of snow dumped on the neighborhood overnight. But Deborah Radcliffe, self-appointed queen of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association, had decided that my snow pile was a violation of community standards, and she had fined me $200 to prove it. That was the moment I decided that Deborah Radcliffe had made a very serious miscalculation. My name is Andrew Foster, and I had lived in the Maplewood Ridge subdivision for about 4 years before this particular winter. I bought my house because it was a solid colonial on a quiet street, good bones, decent yard, and the neighbors seemed normal. The HOA was already in place when I moved in, and for the first couple of years it was mostly harmless. There were the usual reminders about keeping your lawn mowed and not parking boats in the driveway, and I followed all of it without complaint because I genuinely didn't want to be a problem neighbor. I pay my fees on time. I keep my property in good shape. I've always been that kind of person. But somewhere along the way, Deborah Radcliffe had decided that she was going to transform the Maplewood Ridge HOA from a simple neighborhood management organization into her personal fiefdom, and she had done so with impressive efficiency. She was the board president, had been for 3 years, and she ran the thing like it was her own private empire. Every violation notice, every fine, every absurd new rule that got pushed through at poorly attended board meetings seemed to trace back to her. She had a particular talent for finding problems that didn't really exist and then charging people money to fix them. Most people just paid up because arguing with the HOA felt like too much effort, and Deborah knew that. She was counting on it. The February that everything exploded had started with what the local news was calling the worst back-to-back snowstorms in 15 years. The first storm hit us on a Thursday night and ran through Friday, dropping just over a foot of snow. Then, before anyone had really got their act together to deal with that, a second system moved through Sunday into Monday and added another 4 to 5 inches on top. By Tuesday morning, when I woke up, my driveway looked like the surface of some polar planet. The snow was heavy, wet, and compacted, and it was well below freezing with a wind chill that made going outside feel genuinely hostile. I spent about 2 hours Tuesday morning clearing my driveway. I've got a decent snow blower which helped, but the bottom layer had frozen solid overnight, and I needed the shovel too. I worked in sections, blowing and scraping, and I piled everything up in a big mound right along the inside of my fence line, which runs along the eastern edge of my property. There's a good 10 feet between my fence and the edge of the road, so the pile wasn't near the sidewalk or the street. It was tucked against the fence on my own property. It was tall, maybe 5 feet, because there was a lot of snow, but it was neat and contained and absolutely not in anyone's way. I went inside, drank a badly needed cup of coffee, and was halfway through warming my hands back to a normal temperature when I heard the crunch of footsteps on snow outside. I looked out the front window and saw Deborah Radcliffe walking slowly past my property with her phone out, taking pictures of my snow pile. She was wearing her enormous puffy coat, the one that made her look like a coral-colored marshmallow, and she had her reading glasses on top of her head like she always did when she was in official business mode. She stood there for a solid 3 minutes photographing my fence from multiple angles, and then she walked back down the street toward her own house, which was 3 doors down from mine. I should have known then that something was coming. But honestly, I had shoveled for 2 hours in brutal cold and I was tired, and I figured she was just being weird, which she often was. I didn't think too much of it. The yellow envelope was in my mailbox by Wednesday afternoon. $200 fine. The stated violation was Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Maplewood Ridge Community Standards, which prohibits the accumulation of debris, refuse, or unsightly material along property fence lines visible from the public roadway. They had classified my snow pile as unsightly material. Snow. They fined me for snow. Snow that fell from the sky that I cleared from my own property, that I stacked on my own property. $200. I stood there in the cold reading this thing 3 times because I genuinely thought I was misunderstanding it. But no, it was perfectly clear. Deborah Radcliffe had looked out her window, watched a storm bury our entire neighborhood, watched me spend 2 hours physically clearing my property, and decided that the place I put the snow was a violation of the rules. Now here's the thing about me that Deborah had apparently not bothered to figure out before she started messing with me. I'm a civil litigation paralegal. I've worked in a law office for 11 years. I know how to read documents carefully, and I have a deep and instinctive interest in whether rules are actually being applied the way they're written. When I got inside and sat down at my kitchen table with the fine notice and my laptop, I pulled up the full Maplewood Ridge HOA governing documents, which are technically public record and available on the county website, and I read Section 7, Paragraph 3 very carefully. The section said, and I'm not embellishing here, no homeowner shall allow the accumulation of debris, refuse, garbage, abandoned vehicles, derelict equipment, or other unsightly materials to remain along fence lines or exterior property boundaries where such accumulation is visible from the public roadway for a period exceeding 30 days. 30 days. The accumulation had to be there for more than 30 days to be a violation. My snow pile was 2 days old. It had been there since Monday. And also, and this is the part that really got me, it listed specific examples of what counted as unsightly materials, and every single example was man-made refuse, trash, old equipment, abandoned junk. Nothing in the section even came close to addressing naturally occurring weather phenomena like snow. So not only had Deborah invented a snow violation out of thin air, she had also deliberately misread the time requirement to fine me 2 days into a 30-day window. This wasn't a gray area. This was a clear, demonstrable misapplication of the HOA rules. I drafted a formal written response to the fine that night. I cited the specific section, quoted the 30-day language, noted the absence of any provision addressing snow accumulation, and formally disputed the fine. I sent it certified mail to the HOA's official mailing address the next morning and emailed a copy to the general HOA inbox. I was calm, professional, and thorough. I expected this to be resolved quickly, because honestly, even if Deborah wanted to be difficult about it, the documents were clear. What I did not expect was what happened next. 5 days later, I got a letter back from the HOA written on their official letterhead, signed by Deborah Radcliffe in her capacity as board president, stating that my dispute had been reviewed and denied. The letter claimed that the board had exercised its authority to interpret community standards in the interest of neighborhood aesthetics, and that the fine stood. They also added a new fee of $50 as an administrative processing charge for submitting the dispute. So now I owed $250 for a snow pile that had, by this point, already started to melt on its own, because the temperatures had crept back up into the 30s. I sat with this for about 24 hours. I talked to my neighbor Gary across the street, who had gotten a different fine from the HOA last fall for having a potted plant on his front porch that was allegedly the wrong color. I talked to a woman named Sandra who lived at the end of the cul-de-sac and had been fined for leaving her garbage cans out 3 hours past the collection window. I started asking around the neighborhood and realized pretty quickly that Deborah had been running a fine machine for well over a year, collecting fees from people on shaky to non-existent violations, and pocketing them into the HOA's general fund, which she controlled. Nobody had pushed back seriously because nobody had really dug into the documents. I dug in, and I started talking to people. But before any of that could build into something organized, Deborah decided to escalate again, because apparently she had sensed that I wasn't going to roll over quietly and she wanted to make a point. The Thursday after I got the denial letter, I came home from work to find another yellow envelope. This one was for $250, citing a continued violation for the snow pile. The pile had been melting for days at this point. There was barely anything left. But Deborah had apparently driven past my property sometime in the last 48 hours, decided enough snow was still visible, and filed another violation. Now, I owed $500 total for snow that was actively disappearing on its own. Something in me went very still and very focused when I read that second fine. I've been told by people who know me well that this is a dangerous state for me to get into, because when I get quiet and focused like that, I tend to be extremely effective. I didn't yell. I didn't call Deborah. I didn't write another formal letter. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and I started making a plan. The first part of the plan involved doing something that was entirely within my rights, and also, I will admit, extremely satisfying to think about. Our neighborhood had gotten more snow forecast for the weekend, another 4 to 6 inches expected Saturday night into Sunday. While most people were dreading another round of shoveling, I was genuinely looking forward to it. Saturday night, I watched the snow come down from my living room window. It was the kind of steady, quiet snowfall that makes everything look clean and still, and under different circumstances, I would have just appreciated it. By Sunday morning, there were about 5 inches of fresh snow across everything. I had my coffee, got suited up, and went to work. I did not touch the shovel this time. What I used instead were my snow blower, my large steel snow scoop, and my truck with the plow attachment that I had bought 2 winters ago because our street took forever to get plowed by the city. I cleared my entire driveway, my walkway, my front path, everything. But instead of piling the snow against my fence this time, I loaded it systematically into the bed of my truck. Load after load, I filled the truck with snow. My driveway snow, yes, but also I made passes up and down the street, clearing my immediate neighbors' properties and collecting that snow too. Gary came out around 9 in the morning, watched me for a minute with his coffee, figured out what I was doing, and wordlessly went and got his own snow blower. By 10:30, we had accumulated a truly spectacular quantity of compacted snow in the back of my truck, plus Gary had a small trailer he hitched up, and we loaded that too. Then I drove to the Maplewood Ridge Clubhouse. The clubhouse is a single-story brick building on the north end of the neighborhood, next to the small pond. It has a parking lot, a covered entrance, and a set of double glass doors that face the parking lot. It is the official seat of HOA power in Maplewood Ridge. It is where Deborah held her board meetings and posted her notices, and generally ran her little operation. I backed the truck up to those double glass doors, and I deposited every single load of snow I had collected directly in front of them. Gary backed the trailer up and added his contribution. We worked methodically, packing the snow tightly, building it up and out, creating what I can only describe as a monument to my dispute with the HOA. By the time we were done, there was a wall of snow approximately 7 feet high and 15 feet wide, packed solid, positioned directly in front of the clubhouse entrance. The doors were not just blocked, they were buried. I stepped back and admired it. Gary stood next to me, hands in his pockets, nodding slowly. "That," Gary said, "is a lot of snow." "Yes, it is," I said. "You think that's going to make Deborah unhappy?" "I think it's going to make Deborah very unhappy," I said. "But here's the thing, it's snow. It's natural precipitation that I moved from one location on the community property to another. I didn't damage anything. I didn't trespass. The HOA's rules say nothing about where residents can deposit snow on common areas. I checked. Gary looked at me with a new expression I hadn't seen from him before, which was something between admiration and mild concern. "You really did check, didn't you?" "I checked everything," I said. "We got in our respective vehicles and drove home, and I made myself a very satisfying lunch." Deborah Radcliffe's response came faster than I expected, which told me she drove past the clubhouse regularly, probably as part of her daily inspection routine. I got a phone call at 2 in the afternoon from a number I recognized as the HOA's management line. I let it go to voicemail. The voicemail was Deborah, and she was doing that thing she did where she sounded very controlled, but you could hear the fury underneath it, like a pressure cooker where the lid is rattling. "Mr. Foster, this is Deborah Radcliffe calling on behalf of the Maplewood Ridge Homeowners Association Board. It has come to our attention that you have deposited an extremely large quantity of snow in the vicinity of the community clubhouse, which has blocked the entrance to the facility. This is unacceptable and constitutes a violation of community standards. I am requesting that you come remove this snow immediately, or we will be forced to hire a contractor to remove it and bill you for the cost. Please call me back at your earliest convenience." I listened to it twice, took a few notes, and did not call her back. Instead, I went over to Sandra's house and knocked on her door, because I'd been wanting to talk to her anyway about something I'd been putting together over the past week. Sandra was a retired school teacher in her 60s, sharp as a tack, and she had been dealing with HOA harassment for 2 years. She opened the door in a thick fleece and immediately saw something in my face. "You did something, didn't you?" she said. "I moved some snow," I said. She waved me inside, and I sat at her kitchen table, which smelled like cinnamon and coffee, and I explained what had been happening. The fines, the bad citations, the denial of my dispute, the second fine for a melting pile, and then the morning's events at the clubhouse. Sandra listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, and when I was done she was quiet for a moment. "I need to show you something," she said, and she got up and came back with a manila folder. Inside the folder were 3 years of HOA financial statements that Sandra had been quietly requesting and collecting through official channels. She was entitled to them as a homeowner under the state's HOA transparency laws, which most people didn't realize applied to our association. She had been going through them carefully, cross-referencing the fine income with the HOA's stated expenditures, and what she had found was a serious discrepancy. The fines that had been collected from residents, which based on her estimates totaled somewhere north of $18,000 over the past 2 years, were not being properly accounted for in the budget. There were vague line items labeled administrative costs and management discretionary that didn't correspond to any documented expenses. In plain terms, Deborah Radcliffe might have been skimming. I stared at those financial statements for a long time. This was no longer just a weird neighborhood beef about a snow pile. This was potentially financial misconduct involving resident funds. I told Sandra we needed to be careful and methodical about this, and that she should not confront Deborah directly or make accusations until we had everything documented properly. "I've been careful and methodical for 2 years, Sandra said dryly. "You're the one who just buried her front door." Fair point. We agreed that Sandra would continue gathering financial records, while I handled the more immediate situation with the fines and the clubhouse snow pile. I also told her I'd been in contact with a couple of other homeowners who had complaints, and that I thought we needed to call a special membership meeting to air all of this. Under the HOA's own bylaws, any 10 homeowners could request a special meeting by submitting a written request to the board. Getting 10 signatures in this neighborhood was going to take me about 45 minutes. It took me 38 minutes. I knocked on doors all the way down my street and 2 streets over. Most people opened the door, heard what I was doing, and signed immediately. A few asked questions, which I answered. A couple of people came back outside in their coats and asked if I needed help, and I told them the most helpful thing they could do right now was to dig out any written correspondence they'd received from the HOA in the last 2 years and hold on to it. I had 11 signatures before I even made it to the cul-de-sac. I submitted the written request for a special membership meeting via certified mail and email that evening, signed by 14 homeowners. The bylaws required the board to schedule the meeting within 30 days of receiving the request. I was counting on Deborah to try to run it like she ran the regular meetings, which was with a firm hand and a tendency to shut down discussion she didn't want to have. She was going to find that more difficult this time. In the meantime, the situation at the clubhouse was becoming somewhat legendary in the neighborhood. People were driving past it to look. Somebody had apparently posted a photo on the neighborhood social media group, and the comments were a mix of people who were delighted and people who were horrified, which is about the ratio you'd expect. Deborah posted in the group demanding that the responsible party come forward and remove the obstruction. I responded publicly with a very polite message explaining that I had deposited legally obtained snow on common property in accordance with my rights as a dues-paying member, and that I noted with interest that the HOA had not cited any specific rule that prohibited this, given that their rules were silent on the matter of snow placement on common areas. I included the section number from the HOA rules and quoted the relevant language, or rather the lack of it. 26 people liked my response within the first hour. Deborah did not reply. The temperature stayed in the low 30s for the next several days, which meant the snow wall in front of the clubhouse was not going anywhere fast. Deborah apparently did hire a contractor to come deal with it, because on the following Thursday I saw a small plow truck parked in the clubhouse lot when I drove by. They managed to clear a path to the doors, though a substantial amount of the pile remained at the sides. The contractor billed the HOA $340 for the work. I know this because Sandra had a contact on the board, a quiet man named Phil who had been functionally overruled by Deborah on everything for the past 2 years and was not entirely unhappy to see things shifting. Phil started sharing information with us quietly. He told us that Deborah had been furious about the snow pile, had tried to get the board to authorize a fine against me for it, and had been frustrated when she couldn't point to a specific rule that applied. She had apparently spent 2 days trying to draft a new rule after the fact, which was exactly the kind of reactive overreach that makes HOA boards legally vulnerable. Phil also mentioned, carefully, and with the caveat that he was not making accusations, that there had been discussions at the board level about the financial records and that he had some concerns. This was getting serious. I had a long phone call with a lawyer I knew through work, a guy named Marcus who specialized in HOA disputes and real estate law. I walked him through everything: the fines, the misapplication of the 30-day rule, the financial irregularities Sandra had documented, Deborah's attempt to create a retroactive rule. Marcus listened and then was quiet for a moment. "Okay," he said, "the fines are clearly invalid. The misapplication of the rule is not even debatable. You've got a strong case to recover those fines plus costs if you want to pursue it. The financial stuff is more serious and you need to be careful, but if the numbers Sandra has are accurate, that's potential embezzlement. That's not a civil matter, that's a criminal matter." "How careful do we need to be?" I asked. "Document everything. Don't accuse anyone of anything publicly until you have the full picture. Request a formal financial audit through the official channels. You're entitled to that as homeowners under state law. If Deborah tries to block or delay the audit request, that itself becomes evidence of something." I thanked him and called Sandra. We drafted a formal written request for an independent financial audit of the HOA's accounts for the past 3 years, signed by 12 homeowners, and submitted it through certified mail. Under state law, the board had 21 days to respond. Deborah responded in 4 days, which suggested she was more worried about it than she wanted to let on. Her response was a letter stating that the HOA's financial records were in order and that an external audit was unnecessary and cost-prohibitive, and that the board had voted to decline the request. It was signed by Deborah, with what appeared to be Phil's signature as well, though Phil told Sandra quietly that he had not actually signed anything and his signature may have been copied from another document. That was potentially forgery, and it was documented. I forwarded everything to Marcus. He made a phone call to a friend at the county district attorney's office. Nobody was accusing anyone of anything yet, but there were now people paying attention who had the authority to do something about it. The special membership meeting was scheduled for the third Thursday of the month, which was still 10 days away. In the meantime, the neighborhood was buzzing. People who had never talked to each other about the HOA were now comparing notes at the mailbox and in driveways. The social media group had become very active, and not in the way Deborah was used to it being active. It wasn't just complaints anymore. People were sharing documents, citing rules, asking questions. One guy 3 streets over had pulled the county property records and discovered that the HOA was required by its original formation documents to hold an open financial review meeting every year, which had not happened in 3 years. That was another rules violation, this time committed by the board itself. The weather stayed cold and gray through all of this, which seemed appropriate. There was a stretch of 4 or 5 days where the temperature barely got above 20, and the icy roads were a real problem. I helped Sandra put sand down on her walkway twice, because she'd had a close call with a patch of black ice near her mailbox. Gary and I put chains on our tires for a week. The whole neighborhood was in that collective winter siege mentality, where everyone is slightly exhausted and slightly on edge, and having the HOA drama layered on top of it was both an additional stress and, somehow, a unifying thing. We were all dealing with the same frozen, miserable winter, and the same petty, tyrannical HOA president simultaneously, and it created a real sense of shared purpose. The night before the special membership meeting, Deborah made a move that surprised even me, though in retrospect it shouldn't have. She sent an email to the full membership, using the HOA's official mailing list, stating that the meeting had been postponed indefinitely due to scheduling constraints, and that any concerns about HOA governance should be submitted in writing to the board for review. She was trying to cancel the meeting she was legally required to hold. I called Marcus at 9 that night. He confirmed that under the bylaws, once the board received a valid special meeting request signed by 10 or more members, they were obligated to hold the meeting. They could not unilaterally cancel it. Postponing it indefinitely was not a legal option. He said I should respond formally in writing that the membership intended to proceed with the meeting as scheduled, and that if the board did not participate, the membership could conduct the meeting without them under the relevant bylaw provisions. I sent that email at 9:15. By 11 that night, it had been forwarded around the neighborhood substantially. By midnight, Phil had quietly sent me a message saying he would be at the meeting. The meeting itself was held in the clubhouse, which Deborah had unlocked because she legally had to, though you could see in her body language that she would rather have done anything else. I arrived 15 minutes early, and there were already 11 people in the parking lot, stomping their feet against the cold and talking. By the time the meeting officially started, there were 31 residents in the room, which was by far the largest turnout in recent HOA history. Deborah had set up maybe 20 chairs and had to scramble to bring more in from the storage closet, which did not put her in a good mood. She opened the meeting with a very short prepared statement about how the board took resident concerns seriously and was always committed to the community's best interests. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not entirely still. Across the room, Phil sat slightly apart from her with an expression that could best be described as a man watching a controlled demolition he had a small part in designing. I had asked Marcus to be present, and he was, sitting quietly near the back. He was not there in any official capacity yet, just as a knowledgeable observer. I was first on the floor. I stood up and walked through the snow pile fines in detail. The invalid citation, the misapplication of the 30-day requirement, the denial of the dispute, the second fine for the continuing violation of a melting snow pile. I had printed copies of the relevant bylaw sections with the key language highlighted, and I passed them around the room. I read the specific Section 7 language aloud. The 30-day requirement was unambiguous. The absence of any provision addressing snow was unambiguous. I then stated clearly that I had been fined a total of $500 on the basis of a rule that was misquoted, misapplied, and irrelevant to the actual situation, and that I was formally demanding the return of both fines plus the administrative fee. Deborah started to interject that the board had the authority to interpret rules in the interest of community aesthetics, and a woman named Karen Hollies in the second row cut her off immediately. "That's not how rules work, Deborah," Karen said. "You can't interpret away a specific time requirement. It says 30 days. It's not ambiguous." Several people in the room voiced agreement. Deborah looked like she had bitten into something sour. Sandra then stood up and presented the financial discrepancy she'd found. She was measured, precise, and very clear about what was documented versus what was being questioned. She presented the financial statements side by side with the fine income records, pointed to the line items that didn't correspond to any documented expenditures, and noted the total discrepancy, which her analysis put at approximately $21,000 over 3 years. She asked that an independent auditor be appointed immediately. The room was very quiet during Sandra's presentation. You could hear the heating system working, a low hum and click that punctuated the silence as people absorbed what they were looking at. Deborah said the financials were complicated and that Sandra was not a certified accountant and was misreading them. Sandra looked at her for a moment and said, very calmly, "Then an independent certified accountant should have no problem explaining where this money went." Phil then stood up, which I could see caught Deborah completely off guard. He said he wanted to address something about the audit request denial letter. He stated that his signature on that letter had not been authorized by him, that he had not voted to decline the audit request, and that he had not signed any document to that effect. He said he was formally disavowing the denial letter and supporting the audit request. Deborah's face went through several colors very quickly. Marcus, from the back of the room, raised his hand and introduced himself. He explained that under state law, the unauthorized use of a person's signature on an official document could constitute forgery, and that the attempted cancellation of a legally mandated special meeting constituted a breach of fiduciary duty. He said this not as an accusation requiring immediate action tonight, but as information the membership should have in front of them as they decided how to proceed. The membership voted that night. By a margin of 27-4, they voted to require an independent financial audit to be completed within 60 days at HOA expense. They voted to suspend Deborah Radcliffe from the board presidency, pending the results of the audit and the investigation into the signature issue. They voted to reimburse me $500 for the invalidly issued fines, plus the $50 administrative fee I'd been charged. They voted to appoint Phil as interim board president, and they voted to repeal the $200 administrative fine Deborah had tried to retroactively apply to my snow pile. Deborah stood up when the votes were tallied and said she was not going to recognize an illegitimate membership vote, and that the board had authority over the HOA's governance. Phil looked at her and said quietly that the board was made up of members of the community, that the membership was the ultimate authority under the bylaws, and that she could verify that herself by reading Article 4, Section 2, which he had actually printed out and placed on the table in front of her. She looked at the printout. She looked at the room. She picked up her coat and her bag and she left. There was a brief silence after the door closed behind her, and then Gary, who had been sitting 2 rows back from me, let out a long, slow breath and said, "About time," and several people laughed, and it broke the tension in a good way. It was not over yet, because the audit was still ahead of us, and there was still the matter of what Phil had said about his signature. Marcus had taken photographs of the denial letter and the documents with Phil's authorized signature for comparison. He sent those to a colleague who had contacts at the DA's office. I don't want to overstate my role in what happened next, because honestly it was Marcus and Phil and Sandra who did the heavy lifting on the legal side of things. The audit started 3 weeks later. The auditing firm was selected by the membership at a follow-up meeting, and they were given full access to the HOA's accounts. This required getting Deborah to provide access to certain financial records and accounts that she had been managing personally, which she initially resisted. When her resistance was framed as obstruction of a membership-authorized audit, and her attorney conveyed that information to her, she cooperated. The audit took about 6 weeks, and it was not pleasant for anyone involved. I won't pretend it was fun. It was a long stretch of winter, cold and gray, and there was a lot of waiting and uncertainty. The neighborhood was quiet in a different way than it had been before, not the quiet of people ignoring each other, but the quiet of people watching carefully and not wanting to say too much before things were resolved. But things that winter were not entirely grim. What had come out of all of this was something I hadn't expected, which was that the neighborhood had become more of an actual neighborhood than it had been in years. People were talking to each other. Gary and I had started helping clear driveways on the street after storms, and other people joined in, until it became an informal thing where half the street would be out after a big snow, people bringing coffee and swapping equipment, and getting the whole block clear in a couple of hours. Sandra organized a neighborhood email list that was for practical things like sharing the name of a good furnace repair company or warning people about an icy intersection, and it became active and useful quickly. The HOA mess had, in a strange way, given people a reason to connect. The audit results came in on a Wednesday in mid-April, when the snow had finally started to pull back, and there were patches of brown grass visible for the first time in months. The auditors found a total discrepancy of $23,400 over 31 months. Not all of it was clearly attributable to intentional misconduct. Some of it was genuinely sloppy accounting, but a portion of it, approximately $14,000, appeared to represent funds that had been moved to an account not properly authorized under the HOA's financial controls. That account was connected to Deborah Radcliffe. Combined with the signature issue on the audit denial letter, which a forensic document examiner had confirmed was not Phil's genuine signature, the DA's office had enough to act on. Deborah was charged with embezzlement and forgery. I found out about the arrest from Sandra, who texted me the morning it happened. I was at work and I read the text twice and then sat quietly for a minute. I won't pretend I felt triumphant, exactly. More like something had finally been settled that needed to be settled. The satisfaction was real, but it was the calm kind, not the loud kind. Deborah hired a lawyer, as was her right. She maintained her innocence initially, but the audit documentation was thorough and the forgery evidence was solid. Several months later, she accepted a plea arrangement. She agreed to repay the $14,000, resigned from any HOA involvement permanently, and received a period of probation. She did not serve jail time, which some people in the neighborhood were unhappy about, but the DA felt the plea was appropriate given that it secured full restitution and a guaranteed permanent removal from a position of authority over community funds. By the time summer came to Maplewood Ridge, the HOA had been essentially rebuilt from the ground up. Phil had been doing a solid job as interim president and was elected to a full term at the annual meeting in June. They hired a professional management company to handle financial administration, which removed the possibility of one person having unchecked control over the money. They rewrote several of the fine policies to require board approval by majority vote before any fine could be issued, rather than allowing unilateral action by the president. They created a formal dispute resolution process that actually made sense. The annual meeting in June was the first one in years that felt like an actual community gathering rather than a performance. Phil ran it efficiently and with a light touch. Sandra presented the new financial protocols and the membership approved them. There was a genuine back and forth about several proposals, including one to install better lighting around the pond area and one to update the rules about holiday decorations, and both discussions were reasonable and concluded with sensible decisions. Afterward, people stayed and talked in the clubhouse parking lot for a while, standing in the warm evening air, which felt genuinely remarkable compared to where we'd been in February. I got my $550 back, by the way. The check came in early spring, with a formal letter from the board acknowledging that the original fines had been improperly issued and apologizing for the inconvenience. I framed the check and hung it on my office wall for a while before I actually cashed it, because it felt like evidence of something important. Eventually, I cashed it and spent it on a new set of ice melt spreaders for winter, which felt appropriate. Gary told me at some point, during one of our driveway clearings that winter, that he thought the snow pile in front of the clubhouse was the thing that changed everything. Not legally, he knew the legal stuff was what really mattered, but in terms of the neighborhood's mood. He said it was the first time anyone had pushed back in a way that was visible and undeniable and couldn't be quietly ignored. He said seeing that wall of snow in front of those glass doors was the moment he realized that something was actually going to change. I thought about that for a while. There's something to it, I think. Not that making a dramatic gesture is always the right move, because most of the time what actually changes things is careful documentation and knowing the rules better than the person who's been misusing them. But there are moments when a clear, visible, impossible-to-ignore action is what people need to see before they believe that someone is actually going to fight back. The snow pile was that moment. It was 14-degree weather and a lot of shoveling and a truck bed full of frozen precipitation, and it meant, no, I'm not just going to pay the fine and move on. I'm going to take what you gave me and give it right back to you in a form you can't ignore. Deborah Radcliffe had looked at my snow pile and seen an opportunity to collect $200 from a homeowner who she expected would quietly comply. What she got instead was the beginning of the end of 3 years of financial misconduct, the unraveling of her grip on the HOA board, and a neighborhood that came together in ways it hadn't in years, partly just to spite her, and partly because it turned out people actually wanted to be neighbors and just needed a reason to start acting like it. The winter after all of this was, oddly, one of the better winters I'd had in that house. We got hit with 3 major storms in January alone, the kind of cold and relentless snowfall that would have felt miserable in isolation. But by that point, we had our informal street clearance routine down, and Gary had bought a second snow blower, and we'd worked out a system. Sandra kept the neighborhood list running, and people shared information about road conditions, about a gas company delay that affected several houses on the north end of the street, about a patch of ice near the school bus stop that needed sand. There was a morning after a bad overnight storm where 6 of us were out at 6:30 in the morning, before work, clearing the street together in the dark, headlamps on, breath fogging in the cold, and it was one of those situations that sounds miserable but was actually kind of wonderful. Phil called me a few months after the charges against Deborah were settled, just to check in and to thank me. He said it was funny how a snow pile had been the thing that started it all. I said I thought the financial stuff was already there waiting to come out and would have come out eventually. He agreed but said maybe, and that Deborah had been very good at making people feel like it was too much trouble to push back. I know that feeling. I had it too for a while, before I opened that second yellow envelope and something in me decided that enough was enough. The governing documents of any organization are only as good as the people willing to actually read them and insist they be followed. The people in a community are only as connected as they allow themselves to be. Both of those things are easier to let slide than to maintain. What I'd learned from that winter was that both of them were worth maintaining, and that sometimes it takes a very cold morning and a very stubborn pile of snow to remind you of that. When the following February came around and we had our first big storm of the new season, I watched the snow fall from my living room window with a different feeling than I'd had the year before. It was still cold, still a lot of work, still the kind of relentless winter that tests your patience with the whole concept of living somewhere with seasons. But when I went out the next morning and cleared my driveway, I stacked the snow pile exactly where I wanted to stack it, neatly against my fence, my own property, just like I'd done the year before. And I did it with complete confidence that nobody was going to put a yellow envelope in my mailbox about it. Because the rules, finally, were being read correctly, and the people in charge of enforcing them were the right people for the job. And if that ever changed, well, I still had a truck with a plow attachment and a very good memory for where the clubhouse entrance was. Some fights are worth having. Sometimes the snow pile is the hill you want to die on, and when you're right and you know you're right and you're willing to do the work to prove it, you'd be surprised how much can change in the space of one very cold, very eventful winter. Maplewood Ridge is a better neighborhood now. The HOA is boring in exactly the way HOAs are supposed to be boring. Meetings are short, rules are clear, and nobody has gotten a mysterious fine for a natural weather event in over a year. Gary's potted plant is back on his front porch in whatever color he likes. Sandra's garbage can stay out exactly as long as they need to, and my fence line is mine to use however I see fit. Winter is just winter now. Long and cold and full of snow, the way it's supposed to be, without any yellow envelopes to make it worse. That's all I ever wanted, really.